The heavy silicate brick didn't just shatter the glass. It pulverized the vintage brass cash register that had sat on the counter for 40 years. Hank stood in the dark, the cold night air rushing through the jagged hole in his storefront, smelling of wet asphalt and impending rain. He picked up the stone, his fingers tracing the rough edges until they bit into his palm, drawing a thin line of red that dripped onto a crumpled note. "Mind your own business." The black ink screamed against the flickering light of a dying street lamp outside. Hours earlier, he had stood in the shadows of City Hall, watching a gold ring glint under a desk lamp as a pen stroke signed away the soul of the town. Now, the silence of the streets felt like a predator holding its breath. As a dark sedan screeched around the corner, its headlights cutting through the gloom like searchlights, Hank realized he wasn't just losing his shop. Someone was making sure he disappeared along with it. And the person holding the shovel was the man he used to call his best friend. Hank Matthews turned the heavy iron key in the lock, a sound that usually signaled the start of a day, but today felt like the final click of a trap. As the door groaned open, the stagnant air of the old hardware store rushed out to meet him, carrying the scent of pulverized stone, dried pine, and the ghostly metallic tang of rusted nails. He stepped inside, his boots thumping dully on floorboards that had long ago lost their shine. He walked the aisles where shelves once groaned under the weight of gallon paint cans and cedar planks. But now his fingers only traced long, lonely furrows in the thick gray dust covering the empty pine surfaces. The morning sun, filtered through grime-streaked windows, cut a harsh diagonal across the counter, illuminating a stack of unopened envelopes. Hank reached for the top one, the paper feeling thin and brittle against his calloused skin. A red stamp, eviction notice, stared back at him with the cold indifference of a predator. He felt a tremor start in his fingertips, a subtle vibration that seemed to resonate through the entire hollow shell of the building. The silence of the shop was absolute, an expansive, mocking vacuum that swallowed his ragged exhale and reminded him that the legacy his father had bled for was now little more than a collection of shadows and mounting debt. He couldn't stay in that silence. It clawed at him. Stuffing the notice into the pocket of his worn flannel shirt, Hank grabbed a battered leather folder containing his financial records and headed toward the heart of the city. The walk to Harrington City Hall was a gauntlet of decay. He passed boarded-up storefronts and cracked sidewalks where weeds pushed through the concrete like slow-motion explosions. The majestic stone steps of the municipal building felt steeper than usual, a mountain of gray granite designed to make a man feel small. As he shouldered through the heavy oak doors, the sudden transition from the humid street air to the smell of lemon polish and expensive, cloying perfume made his head swim. He adjusted the collar of his frayed blazer, trying to hide the threadbare edges, and marched toward the tax department. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm he tried to steady by rehearsing his plea for a tax abatement. He looked up at the gold leaf molding on the ceiling, a decadent display of wealth that felt like a personal insult to a man who had spent his morning counting pennies for a bus fare he couldn't afford. The clerk at the window didn't even look up, her fingers clicking away at a keyboard with mechanical precision. "Ninth floor for appeals, Mr. Matthews," she droned, her voice as flat as a dead battery. Hank didn't head for the 9th floor. Instead, he found himself wandering toward the 2nd floor, the executive wing, where the carpet grew thicker and the air turned colder. He moved down the long corridor, his footsteps muffled by the deep navy runner. A sliver of yellow light spilled from a door left ajar, the office of Mayor Richard Miller. Hank slowed his pace. He intended to knock, to demand a moment of the man's time based on 30 years of shared history in this town. But a voice stopped him. It was Miller's voice, a low, resonant bass that usually spoke of community and progress. But now it held a conspiratorial edge. "The environmental impact studies are a formality, Lloyd. Miller was saying. "The council is in my pocket. We can break ground by the 1st of the month." A second voice, sharp and dry as a desert wind, responded. "And the public space requirements? The park?" "The locals are sentimental about that patch of dirt." Hank froze. He pressed his shoulder against the cool, painted drywall of the hallway, his breath hitching. He peered through the gap in the door. Inside, the room was a temple of mahogany and leather. Mayor Miller was leaning over a massive mahogany desk, his face illuminated by a green-shaded banker's lamp. Across from him sat a man in a suit that cost more than Hank's entire inventory. Lloyd Carter, the representative for a multi-state development firm. Miller laughed, a sound that grated on Hank's ears like iron dragging over glass. "The park isn't a park, Lloyd. It's a liability. A 3-acre footprint for the foundation of the North Tower. We'll call it urban renewal. The waterfront? That's prime real estate for the promenade. The old Harrington dies, so the new Harrington can pay its taxes." Hank's stomach turned. Carter reached into a slim designer briefcase and pulled out a blue folder, sliding it across the desk toward Miller. The mayor's gold ring caught the light as he flipped through the pages, his eyes devouring the text. These were the land transfer agreements, the death warrants for the only green space left in the center of the city. Hank watched, paralyzed, as Miller took a heavy fountain pen and signed his name with a flourish on the final page. It was a clean, clinical betrayal. Carter nodded, satisfied, tucking the document back into his case. The weight of what he'd seen pushed Hank backward. He tried to retreat, to vanish into the shadows of the hallway, but his heel caught the edge of a heavy metal display stand filled with tourist brochures. The stand wobbled, then crashed to the parquet floor with a sound like a gunshot. The brochures scattered like panicked birds. "Who's out there?" Miller's voice barked from the office. Hank didn't wait. He turned and bolted. The heavy thud of boots echoed behind him. Security. He hit the stairwell, his knees aching as he took the steps 3 at a time. He could hear the shouting now, the frantic radio chatter of men who didn't want witnesses. He burst through a side exit into the internal courtyard, nearly colliding with a patrol officer who was adjusting his belt. Hank veered sharply, ducking behind a parked delivery truck, just as the officer turned toward the noise from the building. He scrambled through the wrought iron gates, his lungs burning, and vanished into the midday crowd on Liberty Prospect. He didn't stop until he reached the safety of a narrow alley 3 blocks away, his hands shaking so violently he had to shove them into his pockets. The betrayal sat in his gut. Like lead, he waited until evening, his mind cycling through images of the park, the old oak tree where he'd taken his wife on their first date, the playground where the neighborhood kids actually felt safe. He knew where Miller would be. The mayor never missed his Tuesday night rounds at the exclusive Riverview Golf Club. Hank waited by the entrance, a shadow among the manicured hedges. When Miller's black sedan pulled up, Hank stepped into the light. "Richard," Hank said, his voice raspy. Miller stopped, his hand on the car door. He looked at Hank, really looked at him, and for a second, the mask of the politician slipped. He saw the man he used to fish with at the pier. "Hank, you shouldn't be here." "I saw the map, Richard. I heard you," Hank said, stepping closer, ignoring the way Miller's driver shifted his weight. "That park belongs to the people. My father helped plant those trees. You're selling the soul of this town for a kickback." He reached out, grabbing Miller's elbow, his grip desperate. "You're better than this. Remember when we were kids? You said you'd protect this place." Miller's face hardened, the warmth of memory replaced by the cold, calculated frost of power. He looked down at Hank's hand on his sleeve as if it were a stain. He violently wrenched his arm away, straightening his coat. "The Harrington you remember is a corpse, Hank," Miller hissed, stepping into Hank's personal space until their chests almost touched. "It's a collection of rotting wood and unpaid bills. I'm giving this city a future. You? You're a ghost haunting a hardware store that nobody wants. Collect your things, Hank. Close your mouth and walk away. If you breathe a word of what you think you heard, I will bury you so deep the light won't find you." Miller climbed into the car, the tinted glass sliding up like a guillotine blade. The car pulled away, leaving Hank standing in a cloud of acrid exhaust, the silence of the street feeling more ominous than ever. He retreated to the store, seeking the comfort of the familiar, even if it was falling apart. He fell asleep on the small cot in the back room, his dreams haunted by the sound of chainsaws. A sudden, explosive crash shattered his sleep. Hank bolted upright as the sound of cascading glass filled the front of the shop. He ran into the retail area, his heart hammering. A heavy silicate brick lay amidst a sea of glittering shards, having smashed directly into the vintage brass cash register his father had polished every morning for 40 years. Hank ran to the jagged hole in the display window. The cold night air rushed in, smelling of rain and asphalt. He caught the tail lights of a dark sedan screaming around the corner, the tires screeching in the darkness. He looked down at the brick. It was wrapped in coarse gray paper, secured with heavy-duty tape. With trembling fingers, he tore the tape away. "Mind your own business." The note read in thick, black marker. Hank felt a coldness wash over him. But it wasn't from the wind. It was a clarity he hadn't felt in years. He gripped the brick so hard the rough edges bit into his palm, drawing a thin line of red. He looked out at the empty street, the flickering street lamp casting long, wavering shadows. They weren't just taking the park. They were coming for him. The next morning, the world began to shrink. Hank stood at the counter of the local building supply depot, a single sheet of plywood leaning against his leg to patch the window. He handed his debit card to the young man behind the register. The machine let out 3 sharp, mocking beeps. "Declined, Mr. Matthews," the kid said, looking embarrassed. "Try it again. There's money there," Hank insisted. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the banking app. When the screen loaded, his breath left him. The balance was a stark, bleeding 0. A notification at the top read, "Account frozen by court order. Pending tax investigation." I'll have to come back," Hank muttered, leaving the plywood where it stood. He felt the weight of the other customers' stares, the suspicion that clung to a man whose credit had suddenly vanished. He returned to the store to find 3 men in blue city inspector vests waiting for him. They didn't wait for an invitation. One of them kicked a box of brass screws, sending them skittering across the floor like a hail of bullets. "What are you doing?" Hank shouted. "Health and safety inspection, Matthews," the lead inspector said. A man with a face like crumpled parchment. He shoved a clipboard into Hank's chest. "Anonymous tip about structural instability and rodent infestation. Plus, the Department of Revenue says you're 5 years behind on your municipal levies." "That's a lie." "Tell it to the judge," the inspector sneered. He began ripping the framed business licenses off the wall, letting them fall into the puddles formed by the leaking roof. Hank tried to stop him, but a uniformed police officer stepped into the doorway, his hand resting casually on the butt of his sidearm. Hank watched, paralyzed, as they systematically trashed the remains of his livelihood, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. By noon, a bright yellow notice was glued to his front door. "Immediate vacancy required." Property seized by Harrington Municipal Authority. Desperate, Hank headed for the office of the Harrington Gazette. Barney, the editor, had been his friend for decades. Barney was the kind of man who drank his coffee black and believed in the sanctity of the printed word. But when Hank burst into the office, Barney didn't look up. He was staring at a crack in the ceiling as if it were the most interesting thing in the world. "Barney, look at this," Hank said, slamming his folder of notes on the desk. "Miller is selling the park. I have the dates, the company names." Barney pushed the folder back with the tip of a pencil, as if it were radioactive. "Can't help you, Hank." "What? Why?" "Miller was here this morning," Barney whispered, his voice trembling. "He reminded me that the city owns the building we lease. He mentioned a sudden interest in zoning violations for the press room. He said if I ran a word of your delusions, the Gazette would be a parking lot by Friday." Barney finally looked at him, and Hank saw the hollowed-out eyes of a man who had traded his spine for a paycheck. "Go home, Hank. People are saying you've had a breakdown. Don't make it worse." Hank walked out into a town that had become a foreign country. He stopped at Al's diner, hoping for a cup of coffee to steady his nerves. But the moment the bell chimed, the room went silent. Old man Greg, who Hank had played poker with every Tuesday for 20 years, grabbed his plate and moved to a corner booth, his eyes fixed on his mashed potatoes. The waitress, a girl Hank had known since she was in diapers, stood at the far end of the counter, vigorously scrubbing a spot that wasn't there. He heard a whisper from a nearby table, something about mental instability and dangerous behavior. The isolation was a physical weight. He walked back toward his apartment above the store, his head down. As he crossed the darkened parking lot, two shadows detached themselves from the brick wall. Before he could react, he was slammed against the cold concrete. A hand like a vice gripped his throat, and he felt the icy, needle-sharp point of a blade press against the soft skin under his jaw. "The mayor wants you to know he's disappointed, Hank," a voice rumbled in his ear, smelling of stale cigarettes and cheap bourbon. "He says accidents happen to confused old men. Next time, you won't be getting up off the asphalt. You'll be heading to the morgue with a toe tag." They threw him to the ground, the impact rattling his teeth. By the time he scrambled to his feet, they were gone, leaving him gasping in the dirt. He reached his door, but it swung open before he could turn the key. The frame had been splintered, the wood weeping splinters. Inside, his life had been shredded. His wife's favorite armchair was sliced open, the stuffing spilling out like entrails. The photos on the mantel were smashed, their glass ground into the rug. He saw the wedding photo, the one he'd kept for 15 years after the cancer took her, and his heart broke. A muddy boot print was stamped right across her smiling face. "It's a shame, isn't it?" Hank spun around. Mayor Miller was standing in the middle of the wreckage, looking as if he'd just stepped out of a tailor's shop. He sat in the ruined armchair, crossing his legs with casual elegance. He pulled out a gold lighter, the click-clack of the lid echoing in the hollowed-out room. "You're a stubborn man, Hank. I admire that," Miller said, the flame of the lighter reflecting in his cold, blue eyes. "But you're an anchor. This city is trying to swim, and you're dragging us into the silt. Think of the jobs. Think of the tax revenue. You're being selfish. You're holding on to a memory while the living are starving." "I'm holding on to the truth," Hank rasped, his voice shaking with a mixture of terror and fury. Miller stood up, his face inches from Hank's. "Truth is what I say it is. Right now, the truth is that you're a broken man who can't pay his bills and is lashing out at his betters. Don't make me turn you into a tragedy, Hank." Hank didn't answer. He grabbed Miller by the lapels of his expensive wool coat and shoved him toward the door. It was a weak gesture, but it was all he had. He slammed the broken door shut and leaned against it, his chest heaving. He looked out the window and saw a black SUV parked across the street, its engine idling, a single ember of a cigarette glowing behind the tinted glass. He was under siege. He tried to call Joe, the mechanic who had always been the town's resident skeptic. But the phone just rang and rang. He tried 5 times, 10 times, until a mechanical voice informed him the number was no longer in service. Miller had cauterized his world. He spent the night in the dark, watching the SUV. He knew he couldn't wait any longer. The groundbreaking ceremony for the new development was scheduled for the Labor Day picnic on Monday. If he didn't have proof by then, the park would be gone. At midnight, he slipped out the back. He knew the city archives were housed in the basement of the old library, a building that was slated for demolition. He moved through the shadows like a ghost, his knowledge of the town's back alleys finally serving a purpose. He reached the service entrance, a rusted iron door that groaned as he pulled it open. The air inside was thick with the smell of wet basement and decaying paper. He moved through the stacks, his small flashlight beam dancing over the spines of heavy municipal ledgers. He found the section marked Land Use, 1950-1961. He needed the original deed for the park. If his father was right, the land had been gifted to the city with a perpetual use clause that forbade commercial sale. He found the cabinet. He inserted a thin piece of spring steel into the lock, a trick he'd learned from an old locksmith client years ago. The lock clicked open with a sharp metallic snap. Suddenly, the basement was flooded with light. "Over there!" a voice shouted. Hank saw the shadows of Miller's private security, men hired from the development firm, racing down the stairs. He didn't think. He grabbed a handful of documents from the drawer, stuffing them under his shirt. He ran toward the back of the basement, where the old freight elevator shaft stood open. He gripped the greasy cable and slid down into the darkness of the sub-basement, the friction burning his palms, but the adrenaline masking the pain. He landed on a pile of old burlap sacks, the air knocked out of him. He lay there, gasping, as the men shouted above him, their flashlights cutting through the floorboards like needles of white light. He crawled through a narrow coal chute, emerging into the rainy night 2 blocks away. As he ran toward his store, he saw the orange glow on the horizon. His heart sank. By the time he reached the corner of Elm and Liberty, the hardware store was a roaring inferno. The flames were licking the sky, the old wood dry as tinder. He saw Miller's men standing by a black sedan, a discarded gasoline can glinting on the sidewalk. "No!" Hank screamed. The store was gone, but the digital recorder, the one he'd hidden under the floorboards of the counter to catch the inspector's threats, was still inside. It was his only proof of the verbal intimidation. He wrapped a wet rag around his face and plunged into the smoke. The heat was an oven. He crawled on his belly, the floorboards groaning and snapping. He reached the counter, his fingers screaming as he touched the hot wood. He found the hidden lever and pulled out the small recorder just as a ceiling beam collapsed behind him. He threw himself through a side window, glass cutting his arms, and rolled onto the asphalt. He lay there, watching the store collapse into a pile of glowing embers. The patrol SUV sat across the street, the driver watching with a bored expression. Hank clutched the recorder and the documents to his chest. He had nothing left now but the truth. He spent the rest of the night in the basement of an abandoned warehouse, shivering, his clothes smelling of smoke and failure. He played the recorder. Miller's voice was clear, threatening, arrogant. He looked at the documents, the original deed. There it was, in faded ink. "This land shall remain a public commons in perpetuity." Any attempt at sale or commercial development shall result in the immediate reversion of title to the Harrington Historical Trust. The Labor Day picnic was held under a sky the color of a bruised plum. The entire town was there, lured by the promise of free hot dogs and the hope of a better future. Mayor Miller stood on a stage draped in blue bunting, his smile wide and false. "Today, we move forward," Miller shouted into the microphone. "Today, we leave the decay behind." Hank moved through the crowd. He was a specter, his face scorched, his clothes torn and blackened by soot. People recoiled from him, whispering, but he didn't care. He reached the edge of the stage. A security guard moved to block him, a heavy fist slamming into Hank's chest, sending him to his knees. "Stay down, old man," the guard hissed. Hank looked up at the stage. Miller was looking right at him, his eyes filled with a triumphant malice. Hank reached into his bag, pulled out the recorder, and held it toward the main stage microphone. He lunged forward, biting the guard's hand, and scrambled onto the platform. The feedback was a deafening shriek that silenced the crowd. Hank held the recorder to the microphone and pressed play. Miller's voice boomed across the square, echoing off the brick buildings. "The park isn't a park, Lloyd. It's a liability. The old Harrington dies, so the new Harrington can pay its taxes. I will bury you so deep, the light won't find you." The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. Thousands of people stared at the stage. Miller's face went from pale to a deep, ugly purple. He lunged for the recorder, his fingers clawing at Hank's throat. "Give me that, you crazy old bastard!" Miller screamed, his voice amplified by the still live microphone. "That land is mine. I bought this town. You're nothing." The crowd erupted. It wasn't a cheer. It was a low, guttural roar of realization. The people of Harrington had been lied to, and the lie was finally laid bare. The barricades groaned as the crowd surged forward. 2 state troopers, who had been stationed at the back of the crowd, pushed their way to the stage. They didn't go for Hank. They grabbed Miller, twisting his arms behind his back. The snick of handcuffs was the most beautiful sound Hank had ever heard. Hank stood there, trembling, as the troopers led Miller away. He watched the black limousine of the developer speed off, leaving a trail of dust. He handed the scorched documents to a high-ranking officer, his fingers finally letting go of the burden. The victory was hollow. As the crowd began to disperse, Hank saw the looks on their faces. They weren't heroes looking at a savior. They were people who had just lost their jobs, their hope, and their illusions. The park was saved, but the money was gone. The investors would flee, and Harrington would remain the same crumbling, dying town it had always been. 3 weeks later, Hank sat on the edge of the foundation where his store had once stood. The insurance company had denied his claim, citing the ongoing criminal investigation into the city's finances. He was broke, homeless, and the most hated man in town, for many who had pinned their survival on Miller's corruption. He walked to the park. The old oak tree was still there, its leaves beginning to turn gold. He sat on a bench and watched 2 young boys climbing the branches, their laughter ringing out in the quiet afternoon. He felt the weight of his father's medallion against his chest. He had saved the park. He had saved the soul of a town that didn't particularly want to be saved. He looked at his hands, scarred, burnt, and empty. He had lost everything. But as he watched the children play in the shade of a tree that would now outlive them all, he realized that for the first time in 46 years, he was finally free of the store. He was just a man in a park, and that was enough.